Inked in Love. A story of romance, writer's block, and unexpected love. By Wynn Valentine. Copyright C. 2024 by Ivy Wilder. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means, including photocopying, recording, or other electronic or mechanical methods, without the prior written permission of the publisher, except as permitted by U.S. copyright law. The story, all names, characters, and incidents portrayed in this production are fictitious. No identification with actual persons, living or deceased, places, buildings, and products is intended or should be inferred. Book cover and all images created by Dana Sacco. Audiobook by 11 Labs. Welcome to Wonderland. Wren Marlowe's compact car crunched through the snow as she pulled into the parking lot of Harbor Haven Inn and Cottages. She let out a long breath, fogging up the windshield, and took in the quaint, snow-dusted exterior of the inn. Twinkling lights adorned the eaves, and a wreath hung on the front door, welcoming visitors with its festive cheer. As she killed the engine, the scent of pine and wood smoke wafted through the crisp air, instantly evoking memories of cozy winter nights. Wren closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to soak in the atmosphere. This was exactly what she needed, a change of scenery to jumpstart her creativity and beat her writer's block. Opening the car door, she was hit with a blast of cold air that made her shiver. Wren tugged her scarf tighter around her neck and reached for her suitcase in the back seat. It was heavier than she remembered, and she let out a small grunt as she hefted it onto the snowy ground. "You can do this," she muttered to herself, gripping the handle of her rolling suitcase. "It's just a few steps to the door." Those few steps turned into a comical struggle as Wren navigated the slippery path, her boots sliding on patches of ice hidden beneath the freshly fallen snow. She nearly lost her balance twice, windmilling her arms to stay upright while trying to keep a hold on her luggage. By the time she reached the front door, Wren was out of breath and her cheeks were flushed from both exertion and embarrassment. She silently prayed no one had witnessed her ungraceful trek across the parking lot. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, Wren was enveloped by warmth and the soothing sounds of soft holiday music. The lobby was a picture of Christmas cheer, garlands draped along the banister of a grand staircase, a towering Christmas tree adorned with twinkling lights and rustic ornaments, and the crackling of a fire in a stone fireplace. Wren's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail. Her fingers itched to jot down notes, already imagining how she could weave this cozy setting into her next novel. But first things first, she needed to check in and get settled. She approached the front desk, noticing the absence of staff. A small brass bell sat on the polished wood surface, next to a vase of pine branches and holly berries. Wren hesitated for a moment before giving the bell a gentle tap. The clear, resonant chime echoed through the lobby. Wren waited, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She glanced at her watch, a nervous habit she'd developed since her editor had given her this deadline. Time seemed to be slipping away faster than ever, and the pressure to find inspiration for her next romance novel weighed heavily on her shoulders. Just as she was about to ring the bell again, a door behind the desk opened. A man emerged, his movements purposeful and efficient. He was tall, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and eyes that reminded Wren of the stormy sea she'd glimpsed on her drive into town. "Welcome to Harbor Haven," he said, his voice a pleasant baritone. "Checking in?" Wren nodded, fumbling in her bag for her reservation details. "Yes. Wren Marlowe. I have a reservation for 2 weeks." The man, Elias according to his name tag, nodded and turned to the computer. His fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard as he pulled up her information. Wren couldn't help but notice how his brow furrowed slightly in concentration, a small detail that she filed away for potential character inspiration. "Yes, Ms. Marlowe, I have you in Cottage 3, Elias said, his tone professional and slightly detached. "It's one of our coziest units, perfect for a long-term stay. You'll find it fully equipped with a kitchenette, workspace, and a view of the harbor." He efficiently ran through the inn's amenities and rules, his matter-of-fact tone hinting at an orderly nature that both intrigued and slightly intimidated Wren. She found herself nodding along, trying to absorb all the information while simultaneously thinking about how she could work a character like Elias into her story. "And here's your key," Elias said, holding out an old-fashioned brass key attached to a wooden fob with the cottage number burned into it. As Wren reached for the key, their fingers brushed. A jolt of awareness shot through her, catching her completely off guard. She looked up, meeting Elias's eyes, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something, surprise, interest, in his gaze. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Elias cleared his throat and stepped back, his professional demeanor firmly back in place. Wren mentally shook herself, reminding herself sternly that she was here to work, not to get caught up in some romantic fantasy. "Thank you," she said, gripping the key tightly. "Could you point me in the direction of Cottage 3? Elias gave her clear, concise directions, and Wren nodded her thanks before turning to leave. As she made her way across the lobby, she couldn't help but notice several cats lounging in various spots, a tabby curled up on a window seat, an orange fluff ball sprawled in front of the fireplace, and a sleek gray and white cat perched regally on the back of an armchair. The sight made her smile. It added to the homey feel of the place, making it seem less like a hotel and more like a well-loved home. Wren had a feeling she was going to like it here. As she stepped out of the lobby and into the crisp winter air, Wren took a deep breath. The scent of pine and sea salt filled her lungs, and she felt a small spark of excitement ignite in her chest. Maybe this was exactly what she needed to break through her writer's block and create the romance novel of her dreams. Wren pushed open the door to Cottage 3, dragging her suitcase behind her. The moment she stepped inside, a wave of relief washed over her. The space was everything she'd hoped for, cozy, inviting, and practically begging to be written in. Her eyes swept over the room, taking in the details. A plush armchair sat in one corner, a crocheted throw draped invitingly over its back. The kitchenette gleamed with polished surfaces and neatly arranged utensils. But what truly caught Wren's attention was the desk positioned by the window, offering a breathtaking view of the snow-covered grounds. "Perfect," she murmured, already imagining herself hunched over her laptop, words flowing effortlessly onto the page. Wren wasted no time unpacking her most important possession, her laptop. She set it reverently on the desk, adjusting its position until it was just right. The blank screen stared back at her, full of possibility. A soft meow interrupted her thoughts. Wren turned to find an orange tabby cat sitting in the doorway, watching her with curious green eyes. Its fluffy tail swished back and forth as it regarded her. "Well, hello there," Wren said, her voice softening. She'd always been a sucker for cats. "Aren't you a handsome fellow?" The cat meowed again, as if in agreement. Wren chuckled and beckoned it inside. "Come on in, buddy. I could use some company while I work." As the cat sauntered into the room, Wren failed to notice the small sign near the door that politely requested guests to keep pets out of the cottages. Her attention was fully on her new feline friend as it explored the space, sniffing at corners and rubbing against furniture legs. With a contented sigh, Wren settled into the desk chair and opened a new document on her laptop. This was it, the moment she'd break through her writer's block and create magic. She poised her fingers over the keyboard, ready for inspiration to strike. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Wren's fingers remained suspended, not a single word appearing on the screen. The cursor blinked mockingly at her, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo her mounting frustration. "Come on, Wren," she muttered to herself. "You can do this. Just write something, anything." But the words refused to come. Instead, her gaze kept drifting to the cat, who had now curled up on the bed, watching her with what Wren could have sworn was amusement. "Don't judge me," she told the cat, who merely blinked lazily in response. Wren turned back to her laptop, determined to focus. She'd barely managed to type out a single sentence when a blur of orange fur suddenly leapt onto the desk. The cat landed with a soft thud, its tail swishing dangerously close to Wren's open water bottle. "Hey, careful there," Wren started to say, but it was too late. The cat's tail knocked into the bottle, sending it toppling over. Water gushed across the desk's surface, a miniature flood heading straight for her laptop. "No!" Wren yelped, scrambling to lift her computer out of harm's way. She managed to snatch it up just as the water reached its previous position, her heart pounding with the near miss. In her haste, Wren knocked over the chair, creating a cacophony of noise. She stood there, laptop clutched to her chest, surrounded by spilled water and overturned furniture, feeling utterly overwhelmed. A sharp knock at the open door made her jump. Wren turned to see Elias standing in the doorway, his eyes widening as he took in the chaotic scene before him. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. Wren opened her mouth to explain, but Elias's gaze had already landed on the cat, who was now perched on the windowsill, looking far too innocent for the havoc it had just caused. "Ms. Marlowe," Elias said, his tone shifting from surprised to sternly disapproving. "Didn't you read the sign? Animals are not allowed in the guest cottages." Wren felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she stammered. "I didn't see any sign. The cat just wandered in and I thought—" "You thought wrong!" Elias cut her off, his words sharp. He strode into the room, gently but firmly shooing the cat towards the door. "This is exactly why we have that rule. Animals can cause damage to the property, not to mention the allergies some guests might have." As the cat slunk out of the room, Wren felt a mixture of guilt and defensiveness rising within her. "I really am sorry," she said, setting her laptop down on the bed. "I'll clean up the water right away. No harm done, right?" Elias's stern expression didn't waver. "That's not the point, Ms. Marlowe. Rules are in place for a reason, and as a guest, you're expected to follow them." Something in his tone, the hint of condescension perhaps, made Wren bristle. "Look, I said I was sorry. It was an honest mistake. There's no need to lecture me like I'm a child." Elias raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest. "I'm merely explaining the importance of our policies. As the innkeeper, it's my responsibility to ensure all guests have a comfortable stay. That includes enforcing rules that protect both our property and our other guests." Wren felt her own frustration building. Here she was, already stressed about her writing, and now she was being scolded like a misbehaving student. "I understand that," she said, trying to keep her voice level. "But accidents happen. I'm sure you don't harp on all your guests for honest mistakes." "I address issues as they arise, Ms. Marlowe," Elias replied, his tone cooling further. "And I expect our guests to be responsible adults who can follow simple instructions." The tension in the room was palpable. Wren and Elias stood facing each other, neither willing to back down. In that moment, Wren couldn't help but think how different Elias was from the polite, if somewhat detached, man she'd met at check-in. This version of him, with his stern demeanor and unyielding stance, was both irritating and, annoyingly, somewhat intriguing. Before either of them could say anything more, a plaintive meow sounded from the doorway. They both turned to see the orange cat sitting there, looking between them with what Wren could have sworn was a mischievous glint in its eyes. Snowstorm interruptions. Wren awoke to the sound of howling wind, her eyes fluttering open in the dim light of early morning. She sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and peered out the frost-covered window beside her bed. Her jaw dropped at the sight before her. A thick blanket of snow covered the landscape, transforming the quaint coastal town into a winter wonderland. The inn's parking lot, visible from her second-floor window, was completely snowed in. Cars sat like lumpy white mounds, their outlines barely discernible under the heavy snowfall. "Oh no," Wren muttered, a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She was trapped. Determined not to let this setback derail her already precarious writing schedule, Wren got dressed and tucked her laptop under her arm. She needed a change of scenery, even if it was just moving from her room to the inn's common area. As she walked across the stone pathway, The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted out to greet her. The common room came into view, warm and inviting despite the howling storm outside. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and Wren's steps faltered as she saw Elias crouched before it, stoking the flames. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. The awkward tension from their previous encounter hung in the air between them, thick as the snow outside. Elias broke the silence first, clearing his throat. "Good morning, Ms. Marlowe," he said, his tone polite but guarded. "Morning," Wren replied, clutching her laptop a little tighter. She moved towards a corner table, trying to ignore the way her heart had sped up at the sight of him. As she set up her workspace, more guests filtered into the room, their concerned murmurs filling the air. Elias straightened up from the fireplace, brushing his hands on his jeans before addressing the growing crowd. "Folks, I'm sure you've all noticed the weather outside," he began, his voice calm and steady. "We've got quite the snowstorm on our hands. I've been in touch with the local authorities, and they're advising everyone to stay put for now. The roads are impassable, and they're working on clearing them, but it's going to take some time." Wren felt her anxiety spike. She had a deadline looming, and being snowed in at the inn was not part of her carefully planned writing retreat. Elias continued, seemingly unruffled by the situation. "We're well stocked with food and supplies, so there's no need to worry. The inn has a backup generator in case we lose power, and we'll do our best to keep everyone comfortable until the roads are clear." His matter-of-fact demeanor seemed to calm the other guests, but Wren found it both reassuring and slightly irritating. How could he be so collected when everything was going sideways? As the crowd dispersed, Wren opened her laptop, determined to make some progress despite the circumstances. She had just pulled up her document when a familiar orange blur caught her eye. Pumpkin sauntered into the room, tail held high. The cat's gaze swept the room before landing on Wren. Without hesitation, Pumpkin trotted over to her table and leapt up onto the empty chair beside her. Wren glanced nervously at Elias, remembering his previous lecture about pets in guest areas. She saw his jaw tighten as he noticed Pumpkin, but to her surprise, he didn't say anything. Instead, he just shook his head slightly and turned away to help another guest. Letting out a breath, Wren turned back to her laptop. She had a romance to write, snowstorm or no snowstorm. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she tried to focus on her story. But focus proved elusive. Every time Elias moved about the room, Wren found her attention drawn to him. She watched as he tidied up magazines, adjusted throw pillows, and checked on guests with quiet efficiency. There was something compelling about the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his actions. Wren caught herself staring as Elias bent to stoke the fire again, the flames casting a warm glow on his features. She quickly looked away when he straightened up, hoping he hadn't noticed her watching. Pumpkin chose that moment to stretch, one paw reaching out to bat at Wren's hand on the keyboard. She let out a small laugh, scratching the cat behind the ears. "You're quite the troublemaker, aren't you?" she murmured. "That he is." Elias's voice came from beside her, making Wren jump slightly. She looked up to find him standing by her table, a steaming mug in his hand. "Coffee?" he offered, his expression unreadable. Wren hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Thank you," she said, accepting the mug. Their fingers brushed as she took it, sending an unexpected tingle up her arm. Elias's gaze flicked to her open laptop. "How's the writing coming along?" Wren glanced at her mostly blank document and sighed. "Not great," she admitted. "It's hard to focus on romance when we're all snowed in." A hint of a smile tugged at the corner of Elias's mouth. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. "Being trapped in a cozy inn during a snowstorm seems pretty romantic to me." Before Wren could respond, he was called away by another guest. She watched him go, her cheeks feeling inexplicably warm. She took a sip of the coffee, surprised to find it prepared exactly how she liked it. Turning back to her laptop, Wren found herself staring at the blinking cursor with new eyes. Maybe Elias had a point. Maybe being snowed in wasn't a setback, but an opportunity. Her fingers began to fly across the keys as a new story idea took shape, one involving a stubborn innkeeper and a struggling writer trapped together during a snowstorm. As she wrote, Wren couldn't help but sneak glances at Elias, drawing inspiration from his movements and mannerisms. She told herself it was just research for her character, but deep down, she knew there was more to it than that. The howling wind outside seemed to fade into the background as Wren lost herself in her writing, the warmth of the fire and the quiet bustle of the common room creating the perfect atmosphere for creativity. For the first time since arriving at Harbor Haven, she felt truly inspired. Wren's fingers flew across the keyboard, her writer's block momentarily forgotten as she wove a tale of snowbound romance. The common room hummed with quiet conversation, punctuated by the crackling fire and the occasional howl of wind outside. She was so engrossed in her work that she barely noticed when Elias cleared his throat, addressing the room once more. "Folks," he began, his deep voice cutting through the chatter, "given our situation, I think it's best we prepare a hot meal for everyone. I'll be heading to the kitchen to get started on some hearty stew and fresh bread." Wren's head snapped up, her flow of creativity suddenly interrupted. Without thinking, she blurted out, "I can help." The words hung in the air for a moment as Elias turned to her, eyebrows raised in surprise. Wren felt her cheeks grow warm as she realized what she'd just volunteered for. She wasn't exactly a culinary expert, and the thought of working closely with Elias made her stomach do a little flip. "Are you sure?" Elias asked, his tone skeptical. "It's not necessary." "No, really," Wren insisted, closing her laptop with a decisive click. "I'd like to help. It'll be a nice break from writing." "And a distraction from her racing thoughts," she added silently. Elias studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "All right, then. Follow me." Wren trailed after him into the inn's kitchen, a spacious room filled with gleaming stainless steel appliances and well-worn wooden countertops. The sudden quiet was jarring after the gentle bustle of the common room. Elias moved with practiced ease, pulling out pots and ingredients, while Wren stood awkwardly, unsure where to begin. "You can start by chopping these vegetables," Elias said, sliding a cutting board and a pile of carrots and potatoes her way. Wren nodded, grateful for the direction. She set to work, hyper-aware of Elias moving around behind her. The kitchen suddenly felt much smaller than it had a moment ago. They worked in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic chopping of Wren's knife and the clatter of pots as Elias prepared the base for the stew. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with the knife in Wren's hand. She found herself holding her breath every time Elias passed close by, careful not to brush against him in the confined space. As Wren finished with the vegetables, she turned to ask Elias what to do next. The words died on her lips as she found him standing right behind her, reaching for a spice on the shelf above her head. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither moved. Wren's heart pounded in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, though she had no idea what she was going to say. Before she could utter a word, a flash of orange caught her eye. Pumpkin had somehow snuck into the kitchen unnoticed. The cat wound his way between Wren's legs, purring loudly. Startled, Wren took a step back, bumping into the counter. She reached out to steady herself, her hand landing on a bag of flour perched precariously on a high shelf. Time seemed to slow down as the bag tipped, then fell. Wren lost her balance, stumbling forward. Strong arms caught her as she fell, and suddenly she found herself pressed against Elias's chest. For a brief, heart-stopping moment they were flush against each other, Wren acutely aware of the warmth of his body and the strength in his arms. Then the bag of flour hit the ground. A white cloud exploded around them, filling the air with a fine, powdery mist. Pumpkin yowled and darted away, leaving chaos in his wake. Wren and Elias stood frozen, still wrapped in each other's arms, now completely covered in a layer of white. Wren looked up, meeting Elias's stunned gaze. A smudge of flour streaked across his cheek, and a dusting of white coated his dark hair, making him look prematurely gray. The absurdity of the situation hit her all at once, and before she could stop herself, a giggle escaped her lips. Elias's eyes widened in surprise, and then, to Wren's amazement, the corner of his mouth twitched. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, and suddenly they were both laughing, the tension between them dissolving like sugar in hot tea. "I'm so sorry," Wren gasped between fits of laughter, finally stepping back from Elias's embrace. She brushed ineffectually at the flour coating her sweater, only succeeding in smearing it further. "Don't be," Elias replied, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "I haven't laughed like that in, well, longer than I care to admit." Wren's heart did a little flip at the sight of his smile. It transformed his face, softening the stern lines and making him look years younger. She found herself wishing she could make him smile like that more often. "We should probably clean this up," she said, gesturing at the flour-covered kitchen. Elias nodded, still chuckling. "Probably, but first—" He reached out and gently brushed a bit of flour from Wren's cheek. The touch was feather light, but it sent a shiver down her spine. "There, that's better." Wren's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, they stood there, gazing at each other, the air between them charged with a new energy. The spell was broken by a loud meow. They turned to see Pumpkin sitting in the doorway, looking thoroughly unimpressed by the mess he'd caused. "You," Elias said, pointing at the cat, "are in big trouble." Pumpkin simply yawned in response, then sauntered away, leaving floury paw prints in his wake. Wren and Elias looked at each other and burst into laughter once more. As they set about cleaning up the kitchen, Wren couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between them. The frosty awkwardness had melted away, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat of the kitchen. As she wiped flour from the counter, Wren snuck glances at Elias, watching the way he moved with easy grace even while covered in white powder. She found herself wondering what other surprises might be hiding beneath his stern exterior. And as they worked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for cleaning supplies, Wren realized that being snowed in at Harbor Haven might not be such a bad thing after all. Snowman Showdown. Wren awoke to a cacophony of excited voices filtering through her window. Rubbing the sleep from her eyes, she padded over to the frosted glass and peered out. The town square, visible from her room at Harbor Haven, was alive with activity. Colorful banners fluttered in the crisp morning air, announcing the annual Snowman Showdown competition in cheerful lettering. Curiosity piqued, Wren quickly dressed and made her way downstairs. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she caught sight of Elias in the lobby, his brow furrowed as he spoke with a petite, silver-haired woman. "I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Winters, but I'm not really the snowman building type," Elias was saying, his posture stiff and uncomfortable. The woman, Mrs. Winters, Wren presumed, waved off his protests with a laugh. "Nonsense, Elias. Poor Mr. Jenkins is down with the flu, and we can't have an odd number of contestants. You simply must participate." Elias sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine, but don't expect anything spectacular." As Wren approached, Mrs. Winters's eyes lit up. "Oh, perfect timing!" she exclaimed, grabbing Wren's arm and pulling her into the conversation. "You must be our visiting writer. I'm Dot Winters, head of the Snowman Showdown Committee." Before Wren could respond, Dot continued, "We've just had a last-minute dropout, and Elias here has graciously agreed to step in. But he'll need a partner." She looked meaningfully between Wren and Elias. Wren's eyes widened as she realized where this was going. "Oh, I don't know if—" "Splendid!" Dot clapped her hands together. "It's settled then. You two will make a wonderful team." Elias and Wren exchanged a glance, the awkwardness between them palpable. After their flour-covered kitchen incident the day before, they'd been tiptoeing around each other, unsure of how to navigate their newly thawed relationship. Before either could object, Dot was ushering them out the door and into the bustling town square. The air was filled with laughter and the scrape of shovels against packed snow. Families and friends huddled together, planning their creations with animated gestures. Dot led them to an empty patch of snow, cordoned off with a cheery red ribbon. "Here's your space," she said, handing them each a small shovel. "Remember, you have 2 hours. Good luck." As Dot hurried off to oversee the rest of the competition, Wren and Elias stood side by side, surveying their designated area. Wren's mind was already racing with possibilities. She imagined a whimsical scene, perhaps a snow family having a picnic, or a fantastical creature straight out of a fairy tale. She turned to Elias, her eyes bright with excitement. What if we did something really unique, like a snow dragon or maybe a whole winter wonderland scene? Elias, however, was eyeing the space with a more practical gaze. I think we should stick to something simple, he said, his tone measured. A classic snowman is sturdy and reliable. We don't want it falling apart halfway through the competition. Wren's enthusiasm deflated slightly. But everyone will be doing classic snowmen, she argued. This is our chance to really stand out. Standing out isn't always a good thing, Elias countered, already beginning to pack snow for the base. Sometimes it's better to excel at the basics than to fail spectacularly at something complicated. Wren felt her frustration rising. She'd thought they'd made progress yesterday, but here he was, back to his rigid, unadventurous self. Come on, Elias, she pleaded. Where's your sense of fun? This is supposed to be enjoyable. I'm here to participate, not to have fun, Elias replied, his jaw set stubbornly. Their disagreement was beginning to draw amused glances from nearby competitors. Wren could feel her cheeks burning, partly from the cold and partly from embarrassment. This was not how she'd envisioned her morning going. As Elias continued to methodically pack snow, pointedly ignoring her suggestions, Wren felt a mischievous impulse take hold. Before she could talk herself out of it, she scooped up a handful of snow and tossed it playfully at Elias. The snow hit him square in the back of the head, leaving a dusting of white on his dark hair. Elias froze, his shoulders tensing. For a moment, Wren feared she'd made a terrible mistake. Slowly, Elias turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, and Wren held her breath, waiting for the lecture she was sure was coming. Wren held her breath, waiting for Elias's reaction to her impulsive snowball toss. His face was unreadable for a moment, then something shifted in his eyes. In one fluid motion, he scooped up a handful of snow and lobbed it back at her. She squealed, ducking just in time. The snowball sailed over her head, but Wren's dodge sent her stumbling backward into their half-formed snowman base. As she flailed, trying to regain her balance, she caught sight of Elias's face. To her amazement, a grin was tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, it's on," Wren declared, grabbing another handful of snow. For the next few minutes, their designated competition space became a battlefield of flying snow and breathless laughter. Wren darted behind their meager snowman for cover, while Elias used his height advantage to lob snowballs over her makeshift fort. Their competitive spirits, so at odds moments ago, now aligned in this impromptu skirmish. Wren couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed this hard. She peeked around the snowman, catching sight of Elias with his guard down, his usual stoic expression replaced by one of boyish glee. The sight made her pause, snowball poised in her hand. "Time check!" Dot's voice rang out across the square. "1 hour left, everyone!" Reality crashed back in. Wren and Elias locked eyes, their shared moment of frivolity fading as they realized how much time they'd wasted. "Truce?" Wren offered, lowering her snowball. Elias nodded, brushing snow from his coat. "Truce. We should probably get back to work." They surveyed their competition space, now more closely resembling a war zone than the beginnings of a snowman. Wren felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have started that. Now we're behind." To her surprise, Elias shook his head. "No, I needed that," he admitted quietly. "I forget sometimes that it's okay to have a little fun." Wren felt a warmth bloom in her chest despite the chill in the air. "Well, let's see if we can have some fun with this snowman, shall we? I still think we can do something unique, but maybe not as elaborate as a snow dragon." Elias considered for a moment, then nodded. "All right, what if we do a classic snowman, but add some creative details inspired by the town?" "That's perfect!" Wren exclaimed, her mind already racing with ideas. "We could give him a tiny lighthouse for a hat, or maybe fishing gear." As they set to work, Wren found herself stealing glances at Elias. She noticed things she hadn't before: the careful precision of his movements as he packed snow, the slight furrow of concentration between his brows. His large hands, which she'd previously thought of as clumsy, moved with surprising gentleness as he shaped the snowman's features. Without realizing it, Wren began mentally jotting down these observations. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead as he leaned in to adjust a detail, the low timbre of his voice as he suggested ideas. These were the kind of intimate details that brought a character to life on the page, and Wren found herself unconsciously weaving them into the mental outline of her novel's hero. As they worked, Elias gradually relaxed. His movements became less rigid, and he even cracked a few jokes, dry humor that caught Wren off guard and made her laugh. At one point, as Wren was struggling to attach a pair of driftwood arms to their creation, Elias surprised her by suggesting they position them as if the snowman was mid-wave. "See, if we angle it like this," he demonstrated, gently adjusting the stick. "It looks like he's greeting everyone who passes by, like a friendly town mascot." Wren beamed at him. "That's brilliant, Elias. I knew you had some creativity hidden in there somewhere." A faint blush colored his cheeks, visible even in the winter chill. "Don't go spreading that around," he grumbled, but there was no real heat behind his words. As they put the finishing touches on their snowman, complete with a miniature lighthouse perched jauntily on its head and a scarf made from dried seaweed, Wren stepped back to admire their handiwork. But her gaze drifted beyond their creation, taking in the entire town square with fresh eyes. Colorful storefronts lined the perimeter, their windows frosted and twinkling with holiday lights. Children darted between the competing teams, their laughter carried on the crisp winter air. Everywhere she looked, she saw neighbors helping each other, sharing tools and encouragement. The sense of community was palpable, wrapping around her like a warm blanket. Wren felt something shift inside her. All these little details, the quaint shops, the festive atmosphere, the way everyone came together for this silly competition, began to weave together in her mind. She could almost see the words forming on the page, a story unfolding about a tight-knit community and the magic of human connection. "Time's up!" Dot's voice rang out, startling Wren from her reverie. "Step away from your snowmen, please." Wren and Elias moved back, standing shoulder to shoulder as they admired their creation. It wasn't the most technically impressive snowman in the competition, but there was something charming about its slightly lopsided grin and the way its stick arms seemed to welcome everyone to Bellsleigh Harbor. "We did good," Elias said softly, a note of pride in his voice. Wren nodded, acutely aware of how close they were standing. "Yeah, we did." As the judges made their rounds, Wren found herself less concerned with winning and more excited about the ideas swirling in her mind. For the first time since arriving at Harbor Haven, she was eager to get back to her laptop and write. She glanced at Elias, studying his profile as he watched the judges with nervous anticipation. There was so much more to him than she'd initially thought, layers she was only beginning to uncover. Just like their snowman, she realized, a classic exterior hiding unexpected charms. Pause and paper pandemonium. Wren's fingers flew across the keyboard, words pouring out of her like a dam had broken. The Snowman Showdown had awakened something in her, breathing life into characters that had been stubbornly two-dimensional for weeks. She barely registered the crackling fire in the inn's common area or the soft holiday music playing in the background as she typed, lost in her fictional world. A loud crash from the common area jerked her out of her writing trance. Wren's head snapped up, her brow furrowing as she heard muffled cursing coming from the direction of Elias's office. Curiosity got the better of her, and she set her laptop aside, quickly bundling up before making her way across the snowy path to the main inn. The office door was slightly ajar, and Wren hesitated for a moment before peering inside. Her eyes widened at the scene before her. Elias stood in the center of what could only be described as a paper explosion. Documents littered every surface, some still fluttering to the ground like oversized snowflakes. The usually neat and tidy innkeeper looked utterly frazzled, running a hand through his dark hair and making it stand on end. Before Wren could announce her presence, a blur of orange fur darted between her legs. Pumpkin streaked past her, tail held high as if proud of the chaos he'd created. The cat's sudden exit caught Elias's attention, and he looked up, his eyes meeting Wren's. A mix of embarrassment and frustration crossed his face. "Let me guess," Wren said, pushing the door open a bit wider. "Pumpkin decided your filing system needed a complete overhaul?" Elias sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. That menace knocked over an entire filing cabinet. Years of paperwork everywhere. He gestured helplessly at the sea of white surrounding him. Wren bit her lip, torn between amusement at the situation and sympathy for Elias's obvious distress. The latter won out as she took in the sheer magnitude of the mess. "Do you want some help cleaning this up?" she offered hesitantly. For a moment, Elias looked like he might refuse. Wren could practically see the internal struggle playing out across his face, his need for control warring with the reality of this situation. Finally, he gave a small, defeated nod. "If you don't mind," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with gratitude. "Of course not," Wren replied, stepping fully into the office. "Where should we start?" Elias ran a hand over his face, looking around the room. "I suppose we should gather everything into piles first. Then we can start sorting by year and type of document." They set to work in silence, the only sound the rustle of paper as they moved around the room. Wren found herself sneaking glances at Elias as they worked. His brow was furrowed in concentration, a lock of hair falling across his forehead as he bent to gather papers. There was something oddly endearing about seeing the usually composed innkeeper so disheveled. As Wren gathered a stack of papers from near the overturned filing cabinet, something colorful caught her eye. Peeking out from between two ledgers was what appeared to be a glossy brochure. Curious, she tugged it free, her eyebrows rising as she realized it was a travel pamphlet for Bali. Before she could examine it further, Elias cleared his throat. "I'll take those," he said, a bit too quickly, reaching for the stack in her arms. Wren handed them over, but her curiosity was piqued. As they continued to sort, she noticed more out-of-place items mixed in with the inn's paperwork. Postcards from Paris, a guidebook for Thailand, a map of the Greek Isles. Each discovery made her more intrigued, but Elias always seemed to be there to whisk them away before she could get a good look. "You seem to have quite the collection of travel memorabilia," Wren ventured, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Elias stiffened slightly, his back to her as he filed some papers away. "Just some old things," he said dismissively, "from before I took over the inn." Wren nodded, even though he couldn't see her. She wanted to press further, to ask about the places he'd been and the adventures he must have had, but something in his tone made her hold back. There was a story there, she was sure of it, but it was clear Elias wasn't ready to share it. Instead, she changed the subject. "I think we're making good progress," she said, gesturing to the slowly diminishing piles of paper. "Though I have to say, I never thought I'd spend my writing retreat organizing tax returns and guest ledgers." Elias turned to face her, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Not quite the romantic getaway you were hoping for when you booked your stay, I imagine." Wren laughed, the sound echoing in the paper-strewn office. "Well, it's certainly giving me plenty of material to work with, though I'm not sure my readers would believe a cat could cause this much chaos." "Clearly, they've never met Pumpkin," Elias said dryly, but there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. As they continued to work, the tension in the room gradually eased. Elias began to relax, his movements becoming less rigid. He even cracked a few jokes about some of the more outlandish guest requests they came across in the old ledgers. Wren found herself enjoying the easy camaraderie that had developed between them. It was a far cry from their initial frosty interactions, and she couldn't help but wonder what other surprises Elias might be hiding beneath his gruff exterior. As Wren placed the last stack of papers into the filing cabinet, She couldn't help but glance at the colorful travel brochures and postcards scattered across Elias's desk. Her fingers itched to pick them up, to flip through the glossy pages and imagine the exotic locales they depicted, but she hesitated, not wanting to pry into Elias's personal life. The silence in the office grew thick as they worked, broken only by the rustle of paper and the occasional sigh. Wren found herself sneaking glances at Elias, watching as he methodically sorted through years of paperwork. His brow was furrowed in concentration, but there was something softer about his expression now, as if the chaos of the afternoon had worn away some of his usual gruffness. Unable to contain her curiosity any longer, Wren picked up a postcard that had fallen to the floor. The image on the front showed a stunning beach, palm trees swaying against a backdrop of crystal-clear water. "Bali?" she asked, her voice cutting through the quiet. Elias looked up, startled. For a moment, Wren thought he might snatch the postcard away or deflect her question. But to her surprise, his face softened, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah," he said, his voice warm with memory. "I spent a month there about 5 years ago. It was incredible." Encouraged by his openness, Wren leaned against the desk, postcard still in hand. "What was your favorite part?" Elias's eyes lit up, and suddenly he was talking animatedly about hidden waterfalls and ancient temples, about the kindness of the locals and the way the air smelled of incense and tropical flowers. Wren found herself captivated not just by the stories themselves, but by this new side of Elias. Gone was the reserved innkeeper, replaced by a man whose eyes sparkled with remembered adventures. "I can't believe you've been to all these places," Wren said, gesturing to the pile of travel memorabilia on the desk. "What made you start traveling?" Elias ran a hand through his hair, looking almost sheepish. "I guess I just got the bug after college. Saved up for a year, then took off with nothing but a backpack and a vague plan. One country led to another, and before I knew it, I'd been gone for 3 years." Wren nodded, understanding all too well the allure of new horizons. "I've done a bit of traveling myself," she admitted, "though mostly for book tours, not quite as exciting as your adventures." "Book tours?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "That must be interesting, meeting fans, seeing new places." Wren laughed, but it came out a bit hollow. "It can be," she said. "But it's also a lot of lonely hotel rooms and pressure to always be on for the public." She hesitated, then added, "Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life, you know? Like the person signing books and giving interviews isn't really me." Elias nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can understand that," he said softly. "It's one of the reasons I came back here, actually. As much as I loved traveling, there was always this sense of impermanence, like I was skimming the surface of life instead of really living it." "Is that why you took over the inn?" Wren asked, genuinely curious. Elias nodded, leaning back against the filing cabinet. "My parents were ready to retire, and I guess I was ready for roots, for a while at least." He chuckled, but there was a hint of something wistful in his eyes. "Though I'll admit, sometimes I miss the freedom of just packing a bag and taking off." Wren found herself nodding along, understanding all too well the conflicting desires for adventure and stability. "That's part of why I came here, actually," she confessed. "I needed to escape the craziness of my life for a while, to find some quiet and maybe, I don't know, rediscover myself." Elias's eyes met hers, and for a moment, Wren felt like he could see right through her carefully constructed facade. "And have you?" he asked softly. "Found what you were looking for?" Wren opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. Had she? She thought about the peace she'd found in the quiet moments at the inn, the spark of creativity that had returned while building snowmen with Elias. She thought about this conversation and how unexpectedly comfortable it felt to open up to him. "I'm not sure," she said finally, honestly. "But I think I'm getting closer." Elias nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Bellsleigh Harbor has a way of helping people find themselves," he said. even if it's not always in the way they expect. They lapsed into a comfortable silence. The tension that had characterized their earlier interactions completely dissipated. Wren glanced out the window, surprised to see that the sun had set, casting a warm glow across the snow-covered landscape outside. "I can't believe we've been at this for hours," she said, stretching her arms above her head. Elias looked equally surprised as he checked his watch. "I hadn't even noticed," he admitted. "I guess time flies when you're sorting through years of paperwork and swapping life stories." Wren laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Who would have thought? Though I have to say, this wasn't quite how I imagined spending my evening when I woke up this morning." "No?" Elias asked, a teasing glint in his eye. "You mean you didn't come to Bellsleigh Harbor specifically to help organize my filing system?" "Shockingly, no," Wren replied, matching his playful tone. "But I have to admit, it's been unexpectedly nice." Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Then Elias cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Well, I should probably let you get back to your writing," he said, his tone warm but slightly awkward. "Thank you again for your help, and for the conversation." Wren nodded, suddenly feeling a bit shy. "Of course," she said. "Anytime." As she turned to leave the office, Wren couldn't help but feel that something significant had shifted between them. The gruff innkeeper who had scolded her about Pumpkin on her first day seemed like a distant memory. In his place was a man with hidden depths and a warm smile that made her heart do funny things in her chest. Wren paused at the door, looking back at Elias. He was carefully placing the travel brochures back in a drawer, but there was a new lightness to his movements, as if sharing his stories had lifted a weight from his shoulders. "Good night, Elias," she said softly. He looked up, meeting her gaze with a smile that reached his eyes. "Good night, Wren. Sweet dreams. Lights, floats, and feline frolics." Wren awoke to a symphony of excited voices and bustling activity filtering through her window. Rubbing the sleep from her eyes, she padded over to the glass pane, her breath fogging the cool surface as she peered out. The sight that greeted her made her blink in surprise. Bellsleigh Harbor was alive with a flurry of motion. Colorful streamers and twinkling lights adorned every lamppost and storefront, transforming the already charming town into a festive wonderland. People scurried about with arms full of decorations, their laughter carried on the crisp winter air. "The Christmas boat parade," Wren murmured, remembering the event she'd read about in the town's brochure. She'd almost forgotten it was today, caught up as she'd been in her writing and, well, in Elias. As if summoned by her thoughts, Elias's voice drifted up from below, carried on a gust of wind. Wren leaned closer to the window, surprised by the animated tone she heard. It was so different from his usual stoic demeanor that she almost didn't recognize it at first. Curiosity piqued, Wren quickly dressed and made her way downstairs. As she descended the last few steps, she caught sight of Elias in the lobby, surrounded by a small group of locals. His eyes were bright, his hands gesturing enthusiastically as he spoke. "And we'll string the lights along the gunnels," Elias was saying. "We can use the old oars as makeshift masts for the sails. What do you think about using some of those oversized ornaments as buoys?" Wren blinked, taken aback by the transformation. This was a far cry from the man who'd grumbled about the mess of tinsel just a few days ago. Elias glanced up, catching sight of her. To Wren's surprise, his smile didn't fade. If anything, it grew brighter. "Wren!" he called out. "Perfect timing. We could use another set of hands. Want to help decorate the inn's float?" Wren found herself nodding before she'd even fully processed the question. "Sure," she said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "What exactly are we decorating?" Elias's eyes twinkled with an excitement Wren had never seen before. "Come on, I'll show you." He led her outside to where an old rowboat sat perched atop a trailer. It was weathered but sturdy, its wooden planks speaking of countless adventures on the water. "This old girl's seen better days," Elias said, patting the boat's side affectionately. "But I think we can make her shine for the parade. What do you think?" Wren circled the boat, ideas already forming in her mind. "We could create a winter wonderland theme," she suggested. "Use white lights and silver tinsel to make it look like it's covered in frost. Maybe add some blue accents to represent the water." Elias nodded approvingly. "I like it. We've got plenty of lights and decorations in the storage shed. I'll grab them if you want to start planning the layout." They fell into an easy rhythm, Wren sketching out design ideas while Elias hauled boxes of decorations. As they worked, Wren couldn't help but notice small changes around the inn that she hadn't seen before. A wreath hung on the front door and garlands draped the porch railings. Inside, she'd spotted a small Christmas tree in the corner of the lobby, decorated with handmade ornaments. "You've been busy," Wren commented as Elias returned with another armload of lights. "The inn looks great." Elias ducked his head, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "Well, I figured if we're participating in the parade, we might as well go all in," he said. "Besides, it's not so bad getting into the spirit of things." Wren smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. "No, it's not bad at all." They worked side by side, stringing lights along the boat's edges and draping tinsel over every surface. Wren found herself enjoying the easy camaraderie that had developed between them. It was a far cry from their initial frosty interactions. As Elias secured a string of lights to the makeshift mast, Wren caught herself admiring the way his muscles flexed under his shirt. She quickly averted her gaze, focusing intently on the ornament in her hands. "Everything okay?" Elias asked, noticing her sudden silence. "Fine," Wren said, perhaps a bit too quickly. "Just concentrating." Elias opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a familiar orange blur leapt onto the boat. Pumpkin, apparently curious about all the commotion, had decided to investigate. "Pumpkin, no!" Wren cried, but it was too late. The cat pounced on a dangling string of lights, immediately tangling himself in the wires. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Elias muttered, but there was no real annoyance in his tone. He reached for the cat, trying to untangle him, but Pumpkin only twisted more. "Here, let me help," Wren said, moving closer. Together, they worked to free the feline, their hands brushing against each other as they carefully unwound the lights. Wren was acutely aware of Elias's proximity, the warmth of his breath on her cheek as they leaned in. Her heart did a little flip when their fingers touched, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. Finally, they managed to extricate Pumpkin from his glittering prison. The cat gave an indignant meow before leaping off the boat and sauntering away, his tail held high as if he'd meant to do that all along. Wren and Elias looked at each other, and suddenly they were both laughing. The tension that had built up during their close proximity melted away, replaced by genuine mirth. "Well," Elias said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes, "I guess we know who the real star of our float is going to be." Wren grinned, her cheeks flushed from laughter and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. "Maybe we should just put a big bow on Pumpkin and call it a day." Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't tempt me, but I think we've done a pretty good job here, even with our feline saboteur." As Wren and Elias stood admiring their handiwork, the sound of approaching footsteps and excited chatter broke through their shared moment of satisfaction. A small group of townspeople rounded the corner, their eyes widening at the sight of the decorated float. "Well, would you look at that!" exclaimed Mrs. Hendricks, the town's librarian, her eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Elias Carr, I never thought I'd see the day you'd go all out for the parade." Wren watched, fascinated, as Elias's demeanor shifted. The guarded expression she'd grown accustomed to melted away, replaced by a warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "What can I say, Martha?" Elias chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "I guess the Christmas spirit finally caught up with me." As the townspeople gathered around, peppering them with questions and compliments, Wren observed Elias in his element. He answered queries with patience, joked easily with old friends, and even bent down to explain the intricacies of the light display to a wide-eyed child. This was a side of Elias she hadn't glimpsed before, open, engaged, and deeply connected to his community. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as they put the finishing touches on the float. Wren stepped back, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face as she took in their creation. The boat gleamed under the twinkling lights, a perfect blend of whimsy and elegance. "We did good, didn't we?" Elias's voice was soft beside her, and Wren realized he had moved to stand next to her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. She nodded, a sense of pride welling up inside her. "It's beautiful," she murmured, turning to face him. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them. Wren felt her breath catch in her throat, suddenly very aware of Elias's proximity. The spell was broken by a loud cheer from down the street, signaling the start of the parade. They both jumped slightly, then shared a nervous laugh. "We should probably get ready to—" Elias began, but his words cut off abruptly as his gaze locked onto something behind Wren. "Oh, no!" Wren turned, following his line of sight, and her heart sank. There, curled up contentedly atop a mound of silver tinsel, was Pumpkin. The cat blinked lazily at them, seemingly unaware that he was about to become an unwitting parade participant. "Pumpkin!" Wren hissed, but it was too late. The float lurched into motion, joining the procession of festively decorated boats and cars. Without hesitation, Elias sprinted forward, leaping onto the moving float with surprising agility. Wren watched, her heart in her throat, as he carefully navigated the decorated surface. "Here, kitty kitty," Elias coaxed, inching closer to Pumpkin. The cat, however, seemed to have other ideas. Just as Elias's fingers brushed his fur, Pumpkin darted away, leading Elias on a merry chase around the small boat. Wren couldn't help but laugh as she jogged alongside the float, watching Elias's impromptu performance. He lunged left, Pumpkin dodged right. He feinted right, and Pumpkin slipped between his legs. With each near miss, the crowd's laughter grew, turning Elias's rescue mission into the highlight of the parade. "Come on, Elias!" Wren called out encouragingly, trying to stifle her giggles. "You've got this!" Elias shot her a playful glare before making another grab for Pumpkin. This time, his foot caught on a string of lights, sending him stumbling. For a heart-stopping moment, Wren thought he might fall off the float, but he managed to right himself at the last second, scooping up a surprised Pumpkin in the process. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Elias straightened up, Pumpkin securely in his arms. He turned to face the onlookers, a sheepish grin spreading across his face. His eyes found Wren's in the crowd, and they shared a look of exasperated amusement. As the float continued its journey, Wren found herself swept along with it, caught up in the infectious joy of the parade. The street was alive with twinkling lights, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and Christmas carols. Children waved sparklers, their faces alight with wonder, while adults sipped hot cocoa and called out season's greetings to their neighbors. Wren's gaze kept drifting back to Elias, still perched atop the float with a now docile Pumpkin in his arms. He was waving to the crowd, his earlier embarrassment forgotten as he embraced his role as accidental entertainment. The sight of him so relaxed and joyful stirred something in Wren's chest. As she walked alongside the parade, surrounded by the warmth and cheer of Bellsleigh Harbor, Wren felt a sudden wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. There was joy, certainly, at being part of such a magical evening, but underneath that was a current of uncertainty, even fear. She realized with a start that she was starting to feel at home here. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. This small town, with its quirky traditions and close-knit community, was worming its way into her heart. And Elias, well, he was becoming far more than just the grumpy innkeeper she'd first met. Wren watched as Elias laughed at something a passing child said, his entire face lighting up with mirth. The sight made her heart skip a beat, and she found herself both drawn to and wary of the feeling. She'd come here for solitude, for inspiration, not whatever this was becoming. As the parade rounded a corner, Elias caught her eye again and gave her a warm smile. Wren returned it automatically, even as her mind whirled with confusion. She was falling for this town, for its people, and maybe even for Elias, and she had no idea what to do about it. Fireside Confessions. Wren and Elias trudged through the gently falling snow, their breath visible in the crisp night air. The excitement of the parade still hummed through Wren's veins, but exhaustion was quickly setting in. As they approached Harbor Haven, she found herself looking forward to the warmth and comfort of the inn. Elias held the door open for her, and Wren stepped into the welcoming embrace of the common room. The crackling fire cast a warm glow over the space, and she felt some of the chill melt away from her bones. "That was quite an evening," Elias said, his voice softer than usual. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "How about some hot cocoa to wind down?" Wren blinked in surprise. It was unlike Elias to suggest anything that deviated from his usual routine. "That sounds wonderful," she replied, trying to keep the shock out of her voice. As Elias disappeared into the adjacent kitchenette, Wren sank into one of the plush armchairs by the fire. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the heat from the flames wash over her. The events of the evening played through her mind. The twinkling lights, the laughter of the crowd, Elias's impromptu chase of Pumpkin. A smile tugged at her lips, but it was quickly followed by a twinge of unease. She hadn't expected to enjoy herself so much. She certainly hadn't expected to feel this growing attachment to Bellsleigh Harbor, or to Elias. The realization made her stomach flutter with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The soft clink of mugs brought Wren out of her reverie. She opened her eyes to find Elias standing before her, 2 steaming cups of cocoa in his hands. He hesitated for a moment, then settled into the chair next to hers. Wren couldn't help but notice it was closer than he usually sat. "Here you go," he said, passing her a mug. "Careful, it's hot." Their fingers brushed as Wren took the cocoa, sending a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the warmth of the drink. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping both hands around the mug and inhaling the rich, chocolatey aroma. For a few moments, they sipped their cocoa in comfortable silence. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows across their faces. Wren sneaked glances at Elias, noticing how the firelight softened his features, making him look younger and more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "I have to say," Wren began, breaking the silence, "you handled that situation with Pumpkin brilliantly. I don't think I've ever seen a cat wrangling quite so entertaining." Elias chuckled softly, a sound that Wren realized she'd rarely heard. It was warm and genuine, sending a pleasant shiver down her spine. "Well, I'm glad someone enjoyed it," he said, a hint of self-deprecation in his voice. "I'm sure I looked utterly ridiculous." "Oh, you did," Wren teased, grinning over the rim of her mug, "but in the best possible way. The crowd loved it." Elias shook his head, but there was a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I suppose there are worse ways to participate in a parade, though I think I'll leave the float riding to Pumpkin next year." They both laughed, and Wren felt something loosen in her chest. This easy camaraderie with Elias was new, but she found she liked it very much. "The parade was wonderful," Wren said, her voice softening. "Actually, this whole evening was, I don't know, magical, I guess." She paused, surprised by her own candor. "I have to admit, when I first arrived, I was pretty skeptical about all this small-town charm. I thought it would be suffocating, you know, but now—" She trailed off, unsure how to put her conflicted feelings into words. Elias waited patiently, his eyes never leaving her face. "Now?" he prompted gently when she didn't continue. Wren took a deep breath. "Now, I'm starting to see the appeal, the sense of community, the traditions, even the quirkiness. It's all so different from what I'm used to, but in a good way. I keep finding myself thinking that maybe this is what I've been missing." As soon as the words left her mouth, Wren felt exposed, vulnerable. She hadn't meant to reveal quite so much. She stared into her cocoa, unable to meet Elias's gaze. "I understand," Elias said softly. "More than you might think." Wren looked up, surprised. Elias was gazing into the fire, his expression thoughtful. I left Bellsleigh Harbor when I was younger, he continued. Traveled the world, saw amazing places, but nothing ever felt quite right. It wasn't until I came back that I realized what I'd been searching for was right here all along. He turned to look at her then, his eyes reflecting the warmth of the fire. Sometimes home finds you when you least expect it. Wren's breath caught in her throat. There was something in Elias's gaze, something open and vulnerable that she'd never seen before. It made her heart race and her palms sweat, and she wasn't entirely sure it was just because of his words about finding home. I think I'm starting to understand that, Wren said softly. Encouraged by Wren's openness, Elias shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on his mug. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. You know, it's not always easy running this place, he began, his voice low. Don't get me wrong, I love Harbor Haven. It's been in my family for generations. But sometimes... He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. Wren leaned forward slightly, intrigued by this rare moment of vulnerability from Elias. Sometimes, she prompted gently. Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. Sometimes I feel the weight of all those expectations, keeping things exactly as they've always been, preserving every little tradition. It's like I'm living in a museum of my family's past. He glanced at Wren, a wry smile tugging at his lips. There are days when I remember what it was like to just pack a bag and go wherever the wind took me, the freedom of it all. Wren nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. It's a lot of pressure, isn't it? Trying to live up to a legacy. Exactly, Elias agreed, looking relieved that she understood. Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful for this place. It's home. But sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough to keep it relevant, you know? The world's changing so fast, and here we are, still doing things the way my great-grandfather did. Wren took a sip of her cocoa, considering his words. I think I know how you feel, she said softly. In a way, I'm dealing with something similar. Elias raised an eyebrow, encouraging her to continue. This book I'm working on, Wren began, her voice tinged with frustration. It's not going well. I'd been staring at a blank page for weeks, terrified that I've lost whatever spark made my last book successful. She let out a humorless laugh. Coming here was kind of a Hail Mary pass. I thought maybe a change of scenery would jumpstart my creativity. Has it? Elias asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Wren shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. In ways I didn't expect, but I'm still scared. What if I can't deliver what my readers are expecting? What if I've used up all my good ideas? As if sensing the heavy mood, Pumpkin chose that moment to saunter into the room. The orange tabby stretched lazily before curling up in the space between their chairs, looking entirely pleased with himself. Both Wren and Elias reached down to pet him, their hands brushing against each other as they did. Wren felt a jolt of electricity at the contact, her eyes darting up to meet Elias's. For a moment, they held each other's gaze, something unspoken passing between them before they both quickly looked away. Clearing his throat, Elias spoke again, his voice slightly rougher than before. You know, I worry about that too, about the inn becoming outdated, irrelevant. What if people stop coming because we're not modern enough? Wren nodded, absently stroking Pumpkin's fur. It's scary, isn't it? Feeling like you might be left behind. Terrifying, Elias agreed. But you know what? Hearing you talk about the town, about how it's growing on you, it gives me hope. Maybe there's still a place for a bit of old-fashioned charm in this world. Wren smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. And maybe there's still a place for stories about love and connection, even in a world that sometimes feels too cynical for romance. They fell into a comfortable silence, the crackling of the fire and Pumpkin's contented purrs the only sounds in the room. Wren found herself studying Elias's profile, noticing the way the firelight softened the lines of his face, how his eyes seemed to hold a warmth she'd never noticed before. When Elias turned to look at her, Wren quickly averted her gaze, feeling a blush creep up her neck. She couldn't quite explain the flutter in her stomach or the way her heart seemed to beat just a little faster when their eyes met. The sudden chiming of the grandfather clock in the corner made them both jump. Wren glanced at the time, her eyes widening in surprise. "Oh, wow, I had no idea it was so late," she said, setting her now empty mug on the side table. Elias nodded, looking equally surprised. "Time flies, I suppose," he murmured, standing up and stretching slightly. Wren followed suit, suddenly feeling awkward. There was a tension in the air, a sense of something left unsaid. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure of what she wanted to express. "Well," Elias said, his voice soft, "I suppose we should both get some rest." "Right," Wren agreed, nodding perhaps a bit too enthusiastically. "Early start tomorrow and all that." They stood there for a moment, the crackling fire and Pumpkin's purrs filling the silence between them. Wren found herself wishing she could find the right words to prolong this moment, to explore this new, fragile connection they seemed to have forged. But the moment passed, and Elias gave her a small, almost shy smile. "Good night, Wren," he said softly. "Thank you for talking. It was nice." Wren returned his smile, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "It was," she agreed. "Good night, Elias." As they headed to their respective rooms, Wren couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. She glanced back over her shoulder to see Elias doing the same, their eyes meeting one last time before they disappeared into the darkness of the hallway. Sweet treats and flower fiascos. Wren pushed open the door to Juniper's hearth, inhaling deeply as the warm scent of cinnamon and vanilla enveloped her. The bakery was a festive wonderland, with twinkling lights and garlands adorning every surface. Her eyes scanned the room, filled with chattering contestants, until they landed on a familiar figure. Elias stood near the back, looking slightly out of place among the cheerful chaos. His usual stoic expression had softened, replaced by a look of mild bewilderment as he took in the scene. When he spotted Wren, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Fancy meeting you here?" Wren said as she approached, her heart doing an unexpected little flip at his warmer demeanor. "I could say the same," Elias replied, his voice holding a hint of amusement. "I didn't peg you for the cookie decorating type." Wren shrugged, a grin spreading across her face. "There's a lot you don't know about me, Elias Carr." Before he could respond, a cheerful woman in a reindeer-adorned apron ushered them towards a workstation. "Here we go, dears. Everything you need for some festive cookie magic." Wren's eyes widened at the array before them. Bowls of brightly colored frostings sat next to containers filled with an assortment of sprinkles, edible glitter, and miniature candies. Cookie cutters in various wintry shapes were neatly arranged alongside piping bags and spatulas. The contest organizer, a jolly woman with rosy cheeks, clapped her hands to get everyone's attention. "All right, cookie enthusiasts, you have 1 hour to decorate a dozen cookies with a Winter Wonderland theme. Remember, we're looking for creativity, skill, and that extra dash of holiday spirit." As the woman's voice faded into the general hubbub, Wren turned to Elias, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "So, partner, any grand visions for our Winter Wonderland?" Elias ran a hand through his hair, looking slightly overwhelmed. "I'm more of a plain sugar cookie kind of guy," he admitted. "This is a bit out of my wheelhouse." Wren laughed, the sound light and melodic. "Well, lucky for you, I've got enough ideas for both of us. How about we start with some snowy landscapes?" As they began to work, Wren found herself pleasantly surprised by how easily they fell into a rhythm. The awkwardness that had defined their earlier interactions seemed to have melted away, replaced by a comfortable camaraderie. She couldn't help but think back to their fireside chat, how opening up had changed something between them. Elias proved to be a quick study, his steady hands perfect for piping delicate snowflakes onto their cookies. Wren found herself stealing glances at him as he worked, admiring the look of concentration on his face. "You're staring," Elias said without looking up, a hint of a smile in his voice. Wren felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Just making sure you're not messing up our masterpieces," she quipped, quickly turning her attention back to the cookie she was decorating. As she reached for a container of silver sprinkles, her hand brushed against Elias's. A jolt of awareness shot through her at the contact, and she found herself holding her breath as their eyes met. For a moment, the bustling bakery faded away, leaving just the two of them in a bubble of charged silence. The spell was broken by a familiar meow from somewhere near their feet. Wren's eyes widened in recognition. "Oh no," she whispered, spotting a flash of orange fur weaving between contestants' legs. "What is it?" Elias asked, following her gaze. "Pumpkin!" Wren hissed, trying to subtly alert Elias without drawing attention to the feline intruder. "How did he even get in here?" Elias's eyes narrowed as he spotted the cat. "That little troublemaker," he muttered, already moving to intercept Pumpkin. But they were too late. With a graceful leap, Pumpkin landed on a nearby table, his tail swishing dangerously close to a large bag of flour. Wren and Elias watched in horror as the bag teetered, seemed to right itself for a moment, and then toppled over the edge. The world seemed to move in slow motion as the bag hit the floor, exploding in a massive white cloud. Flour billowed outward, coating everything in its path, including Wren, Elias, and their carefully decorated cookies. For a moment, there was complete silence in the bakery. Wren blinked, her eyelashes heavy with flour, and turned to look at Elias. He stood there, looking utterly bewildered, his dark hair now a ghostly white. The absurdity of the situation hit Wren all at once, and she couldn't hold back the laughter that bubbled up from her chest. It started as a giggle and quickly grew into full-bodied laughter that shook her flour-covered frame. Elias stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable beneath the layer of white. Then, to Wren's delight, his lips twitched, and he too began to laugh. The sound was rich and genuine, a side of Elias she hadn't seen before. "I'm so sorry," Wren managed between fits of giggles, brushing flour from her face. "I should have known Pumpkin would find a way to crash the party." Elias shook his head, still chuckling. "I suppose we should be grateful he didn't decide to use our cookies as a litter box," he said dryly. Their laughter seemed to break the tension in the room, and soon the other contestants were joining in, the bakery filling with the sound of mirth and good-natured teasing. As Wren caught her breath, she noticed Elias looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. There was warmth there and something else, a spark of interest that made her heart skip a beat. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. Elias reached out, his hand hovering near her face for a moment before gently brushing some flour from her cheek. "You've got a little something," he said softly, his touch lingering just a second longer than necessary. Wren felt her breath catch in her throat, hyper-aware of his proximity and the warmth of his hand. "Thanks," she murmured, her eyes locked with his. The moment was interrupted by Pumpkin, who chose that instant to weave between their legs, leaving floury paw prints in his wake. The spell broken, Wren and Elias stepped apart, both laughing again as they watched the cat saunter towards the door, looking entirely pleased with himself. As the flour settled, Wren couldn't stop giggling. She looked over at Elias, expecting to see his usual stoic expression, but to her surprise, he was laughing too. His deep chuckles mixed with her lighter laughter, creating a harmony that sent a warm flutter through her chest. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them faded away. Wren saw something shift in Elias's gaze, a softness, a spark of connection that hadn't been there before. She felt it too, a subtle but undeniable change in the air between them. "Well," Elias said, still chuckling as he brushed flour from his shirt, "I suppose this is one way to add some holiday magic to our cookies." Wren's eyebrows shot up. "Was that a joke, Elias Carr? I didn't know you had it in you." He gave her a wry smile. "I'm full of surprises. You just haven't been paying attention." "Oh, I've been paying attention," Wren replied, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She felt her cheeks warm, and not just from the leftover flour. Elias's smile widened, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Is that so? And here I thought you were too busy chasing after that troublemaking cat of mine." As they bantered, Wren became acutely aware of the other contestants and spectators watching them with amused interest. She caught a few knowing glances exchanged between onlookers, and she couldn't blame them. She and Elias must have looked quite the pair, covered in flour, laughing together like old friends instead of the reluctant acquaintances they'd been just days ago. They set about cleaning up their station, salvaging what they could of their partially decorated cookies. As Wren wiped down the table, she felt Elias's presence behind her, his breath warm on her neck as he reached around her to grab a towel. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice low. "Didn't mean to crowd you." Wren turned, finding herself face to face with him, mere inches separating them. "No worries," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't mind." For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, as if remembering where they were, they both stepped back, clearing their throats and returning to the task at hand. With their workstation cleaned, they surveyed the damage to their cookies. Most had survived the flour incident relatively unscathed, needing just a gentle dusting off. As they resumed decorating, Wren found herself marveling at how naturally they worked together now. "Here, let me show you a trick for the snowflakes," Wren said, picking up a piping bag. She guided Elias's hand, her fingers warm against his as she demonstrated the technique. "It's all in the wrist movement." Elias nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. As he attempted the design on his own, his tongue poked out slightly between his lips. Wren found the sight utterly endearing. "Not bad for a novice," she teased as he finished, bumping her shoulder against his. "I had a good teacher," he replied, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that made her breath catch. As they continued decorating, their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and playful jabs. Wren found herself storing away little details. The way Elias's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the deep timbre of his laugh, the gentleness of his hands as he worked. She told herself it was for her novel, but deep down she knew these were memories she'd cherish regardless. Before they knew it, the contest organizer was calling time. Wren stepped back, surveying their handiwork with pride. Despite the flower fiasco, they'd managed to create a charming winter scene: snowflakes and evergreens, little gingerbread cottages, and a miniature lighthouse that bore a striking resemblance to the one in Bellsleigh Harbor. As they waited for the judging to begin, Wren caught sight of their reflection in a nearby mirror. The image startled her. Both of them still dusted with flour, standing close together, Elias's hand resting lightly on the small of her back. They looked like a couple. The thought sent a jolt through her, equal parts excitement and trepidation. The judges made their rounds, nodding approvingly at Wren and Elias's display. Wren held her breath, suddenly invested in the outcome in a way she hadn't expected. She felt Elias tense beside her as the winners were announced. And in second place, Wren Marlowe and Elias Carr. Wren let out a delighted squeal, turning to Elias with a wide grin. Without thinking, she threw her arms around him in a celebratory hug. For a moment, Elias stiffened, but then his arms came around her, holding her close. As they pulled apart, Wren's elation was tempered by a sudden pang of sadness. This moment, the joy, the connection, the warmth of Elias's embrace, it was temporary. Soon, she'd have to return to her real life, to her looming deadline and the pressure of her career. "We make a good team," Elias said softly, his hand still resting on her arm. Wren nodded, forcing a smile even as her heart clenched. "We do," she agreed, wishing desperately that their partnership could extend beyond this moment, beyond this small town and its holiday magic. As they accepted their prize, a gift certificate to Juniper's hearth, Wren found herself torn. She was thrilled by their success, by the undeniable connection growing between her and Elias. But the weight of her responsibilities loomed large, a stark reminder that this wasn't her world. She didn't belong here, no matter how much a part of her wished she did. Elias must have sensed her shift in mood. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed in concern. Wren nodded, not trusting herself to speak. How could she explain that leaving Bellsleigh Harbor, leaving him, was going to be far harder than she ever could have anticipated? Crossed wires and silent whispers. Wren settled into her favorite armchair in the inn's library, her laptop balanced precariously on her knees. The warmth from the crackling fireplace enveloped her, and the scent of old books and pine needles filled the air. She felt a surge of inspiration coursing through her veins, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she finally made headway on her novel. The words flowed effortlessly, painting vivid scenes of romance and holiday cheer. Wren smiled to herself, realizing how much her experiences in Bellsleigh Harbor had influenced her writing. The charming town and its inhabitants, especially a certain brooding innkeeper, had breathed new life into her story. Just as she was hitting her stride, a familiar, deep voice drifted in from the adjacent room. Wren's fingers stilled on the keys as she recognized Elias's tone, serious and measured. Curiosity got the better of her, and she gently closed her laptop, setting it aside as she crept closer to the partially open door. Peering through the crack, she saw Elias standing with his back to her, talking to a man she didn't recognize. The stranger wore an expensive-looking suit that seemed out of place in the cozy inn, his posture stiff and businesslike. "The cottages would be the first step," the man was saying, his voice low and persuasive. "It's a prime opportunity to modernize and attract a different clientele." Wren's heart sank as she processed the words. Selling the cottages? Changes to the property? She thought of the charming, historic buildings that had become such an integral part of her stay. The idea of them being sold off or renovated beyond recognition made her chest tighten. Elias's response was too quiet for her to hear, but his body language spoke volumes. His shoulders were tense, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, a stance Wren had come to recognize as his way of holding back frustration. "Look, Elias," the man continued, "I know you're attached to this place, but you have to think about the future. The market's changing, and—" "I understand the market," Elias cut in, his voice carrying a sharp edge Wren had rarely heard. "But this isn't just about profits. It's about preserving something special." The conversation lulled, and Wren found herself holding her breath, straining to hear more. Then, to her surprise, she heard her own name. "What about that writer staying here?" the man asked. "Wren Marlowe, isn't it? Having a best-selling author as a regular guest could be great publicity." Elias let out a short, humorless laugh. "Wren's just a temporary situation. She'll be leaving soon enough." The words hit Wren like a physical blow. Temporary situation? Leaving soon? She stumbled back from the door, her mind reeling. All this time, she'd thought. What? That she and Elias were forming a real connection? That maybe, just maybe, there could be something more between them? Clearly, she'd been deluding herself. Elias saw her as nothing more than a fleeting guest, someone to be tolerated until she inevitably left. And now he was considering selling off parts of the inn, changing the very essence of what made it special. Wren retreated to her room. Her earlier inspiration evaporated. She sat at her desk, staring blankly at her laptop screen, emotions warring within her. Anger bubbled up, at Elias for his apparent duplicity, at herself for getting so caught up in this fantasy of small-town charm and holiday romance. But beneath the anger lay a deep well of disappointment. She'd allowed herself to hope, to imagine a future where Bellsleigh Harbor and Elias played a larger role in her life. Now, that dream felt as fragile and fleeting as the snowflakes outside her window. Taking a deep breath, Wren squared her shoulders and opened her laptop. If Elias saw her as nothing more than a temporary guest, then that's exactly what she'd be. She had a novel to finish, a deadline to meet, and a life to return to in the city. She couldn't afford to waste any more time on misplaced feelings and small-town daydreams. With renewed determination, Wren threw herself into her writing. The words came in a torrent, fueled by her conflicting emotions. Her character's struggles took on new depth as she poured her own disappointment and longing onto the page. Hours passed, and the light outside her window faded from the weak winter sun to the soft glow of street lamps. Wren barely noticed, lost in her fictional world. She ignored the gentle knock on her door around dinner time, unwilling to face Elias or anyone else. Later that evening, hunger finally drove Wren from her self-imposed exile. She crept downstairs, hoping to grab a quick snack without running into anyone. The kitchen was dimly lit, a single lamp casting a warm glow over the worn wooden countertops. Wren's stomach growled as she rummaged through the pantry, searching for something to quiet her hunger. "Wren?" She froze at the sound of Elias's voice, her hand still buried in a box of crackers. Slowly, she turned to face him, steeling herself against the warmth that spread through her chest at the sight of his face lighting up. "I was hoping I'd run into you," Elias said, a hesitant smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I haven't seen you all day. How's the writing going?" Wren swallowed hard, forcing herself to remember the conversation she'd overheard. "Fine," she replied, her voice clipped. "Just busy with the deadline." Elias's smile faltered, confusion flickering across his features. "Oh, well, that's good. I was thinking maybe we could take a break tomorrow and go ice skating at the rink. The whole town will be there, and I thought—" "I don't think so," Wren cut him off, her tone cool and polite. "Like I said, I'm busy." She turned back to the pantry, grabbing a handful of granola bars and studiously avoiding Elias's gaze. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. "Wren," Elias tried again, his voice softer now. "Is everything okay? You seem different." For a moment, Wren wavered. Part of her wanted to confront him, to demand answers about what she'd overheard, but the fear of confirming her worst suspicions held her back. "Everything's fine," she said, forcing a brittle smile. "I'm just stressed about the deadline. You know how it is?" Without waiting for a response, she brushed past him, heading for the stairs. As she reached the doorway, she paused, glancing back. Elias stood where she'd left him, his brow furrowed in confusion and hurt. The sight made her chest ache, but she pushed the feeling aside. "Good night, Elias," she said quietly, then fled back to the safety of her cottage. Once inside, Wren set the granola bars on her desk and moved to the window. The grounds of the inn stretched out before her, blanketed in pristine snow that glittered under the moonlight. Movement caught her eye, and she spotted Elias trudging through the snow, Pumpkin trotting alongside him. Even from a distance, she could see the slump of his shoulders, the pensive tilt of his head. Doubt crept in, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. Had she misinterpreted what she'd overheard? Was there more to the story than she realized? Wren pressed her forehead against the cool glass, closing her eyes as conflicting emotions warred within her. With a sigh, she returned to her desk and opened her laptop. The cursor blinked accusingly at her from the half-finished page. Wren began to type, letting her tangled emotions flow through her fingers and onto the screen. As the words poured out, she found herself shaping her novel's hero into someone achingly familiar, strong yet vulnerable, with a quiet intensity that drew others in despite his best efforts to keep them at arm's length. Wren paused, her fingers hovering over the keys as she realized just how much her creation resembled Elias. She'd given the character his brooding charm, his hidden depths, even the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The realization only added to her confusion. How could she be so drawn to a man she barely knew, especially one who seemed to view her as nothing more than a temporary guest? Hours slipped by as Wren lost herself in her writing, pouring her conflicted feelings into her characters. The soft knock at her door startled her out of her fictional world. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of her. She opened the door a crack, peering out into the darkened hallway. No one was there, but a delicious aroma wafted up from the floor. Wren looked down to find a plate of cookies, still warm from the oven, with a folded note tucked beneath. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized Elias's neat handwriting. Back inside, Wren unfolded the note with trembling fingers. "Wren, I hope these might inspire your writing. The recipe is an old family secret, guaranteed to cure writer's block and lift spirits. If you need anything, I'm always here." "Elias." Wren sank onto the edge of her bed, the plate of cookies cradled in her lap. The gesture was so thoughtful, so quintessentially Elias, that it made her chest ache. She picked up a cookie, the rich scent of chocolate and cinnamon filling her senses. As she took a bite, the flavors exploding on her tongue, a single tear slipped down her cheek. The cookies were delicious, but they left a bittersweet taste in her mouth. Elias's kindness only deepened her confusion. How could he be so attentive, so caring, if she truly meant nothing to him? And yet, she couldn't shake the memory of his words to the stranger. Wren's just a temporary situation. She set the cookies aside and returned to her laptop, determined to lose herself in her work once more. But as she stared at the screen, her fictional hero stared back at her, his qualities an unmistakable reflection of the man in the next building over. Wren realized that in trying to escape her feelings, she had only managed to immortalize them on the page. As the night deepened, Wren found herself caught between the world she was creating and the one just beyond her door. Both were filled with possibility and heartache in equal measure, and she had no idea how to navigate either one. Snowy realizations. Wren stretched as the first rays of dawn crept through her window. She'd tossed and turned all night, her dreams a jumbled mess of unfinished manuscripts and Elias's inscrutable expressions. With a groan, she pushed herself up, knowing sleep was a lost cause. The clock on her nightstand read 6:30 a.m., far too early to be awake on vacation, but her restless mind wouldn't let her linger in bed. Wren threw on her warmest sweater and a pair of thick wool socks, deciding a brisk walk might help clear her head. As she stepped outside, the crisp morning air nipped at her cheeks, instantly waking her further. The grounds of Harbor Haven were blanketed in a fresh layer of snow, pristine and glittering in the early morning light. Wren's breath puffed out in small clouds as she set off down one of the cleared paths, her footsteps crunching softly in the stillness. She wandered aimlessly, letting her thoughts drift. The cookies Elias had left for her the night before still weighed on her mind. His gesture had been so thoughtful, so at odds with the distant man she'd overheard discussing her as a temporary situation. Wren shook her head, trying to make sense of it all. As she rounded a corner of the main building, the rhythmic scrape of metal on concrete caught her attention. There, bundled up against the cold, was Elias. He was shoveling snow from the inn's walkways with practiced efficiency, his breath visible in the chilly air. Wren hesitated, unsure whether to retreat or press forward. Before she could decide, Elias looked up. Surprise flickered across his face, quickly followed by a warmth that made Wren's heart skip. But as he took in her guarded expression, his own features clouded with confusion. "Good morning," Elias called out, pausing in his work. "You're up early." Wren nodded stiffly. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, her tone more clipped than she'd intended. Elias leaned on his shovel, studying her with those perceptive eyes of his. "I hope it wasn't because of the cookies," he said, a hint of teasing in his voice. "I promise they weren't that bad." Despite herself, Wren felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "No, the cookies they were lovely. Thank you." "But," Elias prompted gently, clearly sensing there was more she wasn't saying. Wren opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure how to voice her jumbled thoughts. The tension between them stretched taut, like a rubber band about to snap. "I heard you talking about selling the cottages," Wren blurted out, unable to bear the silence any longer. And about me being a temporary situation." Elias's eyes widened in shock. He quickly set down his shovel and took a step towards her, hands raised as if to ward off her accusation. "Wren, no, that's not—" He broke off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You misunderstood. Let me explain." Wren crossed her arms, bracing herself. "Go on, then." Elias took a deep breath. "The conversation about selling cottages, it's not what you think. We've been considering selling some of the outlying cottages to long-term residents who've been renting for years. It's about strengthening the community, not changing the inn's character." Wren blinked, processing this information. "Oh," she said softly, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over her. I see." As for the temporary situation comment, Elias continued, his expression softening. I was talking to a guest who was curious about why you might be less involved in town activities than our typical visitors. I was simply explaining that you were here on a writing retreat, not a permanent resident. Wren felt her cheeks burning, and not just from the cold. I'm so sorry, she mumbled, unable to meet his eyes. I jumped to conclusions. I thought you were eager for me to leave. To her surprise, Elias chuckled. The sound was warm and rich, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the chilly air. Wren, he said, his voice gentle. If anything, I've been worried you'll finish your book and leave before I've had a chance to really get to know you. Wren's head snapped up, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was warmth and a hint of vulnerability that made her breath catch. I've been such an idiot, Wren said, shaking her head ruefully. Elias grinned. Well, I wouldn't go that far, though I have to admit, the idea of you thinking I was some kind of cottage-selling villain is pretty amusing. Wren couldn't help but laugh at that, the tension between them finally dissipating. In my defense, you can be pretty inscrutable sometimes. I've been told that, Elias admitted. He hesitated for a moment, then asked, Would you like to grab some coffee? I think we could both use a warm-up, and maybe we could clear the air properly. Wren found herself nodding before she could overthink it. I'd like that, she said softly. Wren and Elias stood in the crisp morning air, the misunderstanding between them clearing like fog burned away by sunlight. Wren fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. I really am sorry, she said, meeting Elias's gaze. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions like that. Elias shook his head, a rueful smile playing at his lips. No, I should have been clearer about the changes I've been considering for the inn. It's just, I'm not always great at explaining myself. He paused, running a hand through his hair, a gesture Wren had come to recognize as a sign of his nervousness. The truth is, I've been so focused on keeping things the same for so long, I forgot that sometimes change can be good. Wren tilted her head, curiosity piqued. What made you start thinking about changes? Elias's eyes met hers, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. You did, he said softly. Me? Wren blinked in surprise. Yeah. Elias nodded, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. Having you here, seeing the inn through your eyes, it's made me realize that maybe I've been too set in my ways, that there might be room for new ideas, new experiences. Wren felt a warmth blooming in her chest that had nothing to do with her thick sweater. I thought you couldn't wait for me to leave and stop disrupting your routines, she admitted with a small laugh. Elias's expression softened. Far from it. I've been enjoying having you here. More than I expected to, if I'm honest. He took a step closer, his voice lowering. You've brought something to the inn, Wren, to Bellsleigh Harbor, to my life. It's like you've woken up a part of me that I didn't even realize had fallen asleep. Wren's heart raced at his words, at the vulnerability she saw in his eyes. She took a deep breath, knowing it was her turn to be honest. I've found more than just writing inspiration here, she confessed, her eyes meeting his. When I came to Bellsleigh Harbor, I thought I was just looking for a quiet place to work, but I've found so much more. Elias's gaze softened, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Yeah? Wren nodded, feeling suddenly shy. Yeah, the town, the people, the inn. You. She paused, gathering her courage. Especially you, Elias. A comfortable silence fell between them as they stood there, snowflakes drifting lazily around them. The rest of the world seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in this quiet, intimate moment. Wren marveled at how different things felt now, how the tension that had been simmering between them had transformed into something warmer, softer. Elias reached out, hesitantly at first, and brushed a snowflake from Wren's hair. His touch was gentle, and Wren found herself leaning into it almost unconsciously. I'm glad you're here, Wren, Elias murmured, his hand lingering near her face, I know you came here for your writing, but I can't help hoping. He trailed off, but Wren understood. She felt it too, this pull between them, the sense that maybe, just maybe, she'd found something here in Bellsleigh Harbor that was worth more than any bestseller. Before she could respond, a streak of orange fur darted between them, breaking the spell. Pumpkin, apparently deciding that the humans had been still for far too long, had taken it upon himself to liven things up. The cat pounced and batted at snowflakes, his antics a stark contrast to the moment of quiet intimacy. Wren couldn't help but laugh, the sound bright and clear in the crisp morning air. Elias joined in, his deep chuckle mixing with her giggles. "I swear that cat has the worst timing," Elias said, shaking his head fondly. "Or the best," Wren countered, grinning, "depending on how you look at it." Their eyes met again, and Wren felt a thrill of anticipation run through her. Something had shifted between them, and while she wasn't entirely sure what it meant yet, she was eager to find out. "We should probably head inside," Elias said, though he made no move to step away. "It's getting colder out here." Wren nodded, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. "Right, inside. That's probably a good idea." As they turned to walk back to the inn, Wren felt Elias's hand brush against hers. Without thinking, she intertwined her fingers with his. Elias glanced at her, surprise and pleasure mingling in his expression, before giving her hand a gentle squeeze. They walked in companionable silence, their joined hands swinging gently between them. Pumpkin trotted ahead, occasionally looking back as if to make sure they were following. As they approached the inn's entrance, Wren felt a mix of excitement and nervousness bubbling up inside her. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, she was looking forward to finding out. Elias paused at the door, turning to face her. "Wren, But whatever he was about to say was cut off as Pumpkin, apparently impatient with their slow progress, darted between their legs and into the inn. The sudden movement caught them both off guard, and Wren stumbled. Elias caught her reflexively, his arms wrapping around her waist to steady her. Wren found herself pressed against his chest, her hands resting on his shoulders. They stood there for a moment, both slightly breathless, their faces mere inches apart. "You okay?" Elias asked softly, his breath warm against her cheek. Wren nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She was acutely aware of every point of contact between them, of the warmth of his body seeping through her sweater. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to, Elias leaned in. "Love and light in the harbor." Wren's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed the final words of her novel. With a gentle tap on the period key, she leaned back in her chair, a satisfied sigh escaping her lips. A mix of accomplishment and nostalgia washed over her as she gazed at the screen, the cursor blinking steadily at the end of her story. She stretched, feeling the pleasant ache in her shoulders from hours of writing. The soft glow of the desk lamp cast a warm light across the cozy cottage room that had become her sanctuary over the past weeks. Wren's gaze wandered, taking in the details she'd grown so fond of. The weathered bookshelf, the cheerful yellow curtains, and the hand-carved chair Elias had made for her. Her fingers traced the intricate patterns on the armrest, a smile tugging at her lips as she remembered the day Elias had presented it to her. It was more than just a beautiful piece of furniture. It was a symbol of their growing relationship, of the care and attention Elias had poured into making her feel at home. With a deep breath, Wren hit the print button and listened to the quiet hum of the printer coming to life. As the pages began to emerge, crisp and new, she felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. Her story was complete, ready to be shared with the world. Once the last page dropped into the tray, Wren gathered the warm sheets into her arms, inhaling the scent of fresh ink. She took one last look around the room, committing every detail to memory, before making her way to the main building. The common area of Harbor Haven was quiet this time of evening, most guests having retired to their rooms or ventured into town. Wren spotted Elias immediately. his tall figure silhouetted against the large bay window. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and his face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Hey," Elias said softly, his eyes dropping to the stack of papers in her arms. "Is that—" Wren nodded, holding up the manuscript. "Just finished." Elias's smile widened, but Wren couldn't help noticing a flicker of something else in his eyes, a hint of apprehension, perhaps even sadness. She understood why. The completion of her novel could mean the end of her stay at Harbor Haven. "Congratulations, Wren," Elias said, his voice warm with genuine pride. "I know how hard you've been working on it." "Thank you," Wren replied, clutching the manuscript a little tighter. "It feels surreal, honestly, like I'm not quite sure what to do with myself now that it's done." They stood there for a moment, an awkward silence stretching between them. Wren could almost feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air. "What happens now? Will you be leaving? What about us?" Before the silence could become unbearable, Wren took a deep breath and asked, "Would you like to hear a bit of it?" Elias's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he nodded eagerly. "I'd love to." Wren led them to the cozy seating area near the fireplace. As they settled onto the plush sofa, she flipped through the pages, searching for the passage she wanted to share. Her heart raced as she found it, knowing that these words would reveal more than just her story. Clearing her throat, Wren began to read. The old inn creaked and sighed around them, as if it too was holding its breath in anticipation. Emma looked up at Jack, seeing the flickering firelight reflected in his eyes. In that moment, she realized that home wasn't a place. It was a feeling, and here, in this small coastal town she'd stumbled upon by chance, she'd found it. As Wren read, she could feel Elias listening intently beside her. The words flowed easily, painting a picture of a romance that was unmistakably inspired by their own story. She described the charming inn, the mischievous cat, and the gruff but kind-hearted innkeeper who had stolen the heroine's heart. When she finished reading, Wren slowly lowered the manuscript to her lap. She turned to look at Elias, her heart pounding. Elias sat there, visibly moved. His eyes were bright with emotion, and he seemed to be struggling to find the right words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and earnest. "Wren, it's beautiful. And it's us, isn't it?" Wren nodded, feeling a blush creep up her cheeks. "Yeah, it is. You and Harbor Haven, you've inspired every word of this book." Elias took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Wren's face. "Wren, I don't want this to end when your book does," he said, his voice soft but earnest. "I know it might be too soon, or too much to ask, but would you consider staying, not just as a guest, but as a permanent part of Harbor Haven and my life?" Wren's eyes widened, her heart racing at his words. She watched as Elias continued, his usual composure giving way to a vulnerable excitement. "I've been thinking about it a lot," he said, running a hand through his hair. "We could run the inn together. Your creativity, my practical skills, we'd make a great team. We could host writing retreats, maybe even start a small publishing imprint for local authors." His eyes sparkled with possibilities. "What do you think?" Wren sat there, momentarily stunned by the flood of emotions washing over her. She looked down at the manuscript in her lap, then back up at Elias, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Elias," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I've been imagining a future here too. In Bellsleigh Harbor, at Harbor Haven. With you." She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I'd love to stay, to build something amazing together." The relief and joy that spread across Elias's face was breathtaking. He pulled Wren closer, cupping her face gently in his hands. "Really?" he whispered, as if afraid to believe it. Wren nodded, happy tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "Really," she confirmed. Their lips met in a tender kiss, full of promise and shared dreams. When they finally pulled apart, both were grinning like teenagers. A loud meow interrupted their moment. and they looked down to see Pumpkin winding his way around their legs, purring contentedly. Elias chuckled, reaching down to scratch the cat's ears. "I think Pumpkin approves," he said with a grin. Wren laughed, the sound light and carefree. "Well, that settles it then," she said, scooping up the orange tabby. "We can't disappoint our feline overlord, can we?" The following weeks flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Wren and Elias threw themselves into revitalizing Harbor Haven, their shared enthusiasm breathing new life into the old inn. They started in the guest rooms, redecorating with a blend of cozy charm and modern comfort. Wren's eye for color and Elias's woodworking skills combined to create unique, inviting spaces that guests raved about in their reviews. The common areas were next. They transformed the old library into a writer's nook, complete with comfortable armchairs, good lighting, and a carefully curated collection of books on writing and local history. It quickly became a favorite spot for guests to curl up with a book or work on their own writing projects. Wren's idea for writing retreats took off spectacularly. They hosted their first one just 2 months after she officially moved in, and it was such a success that they immediately began planning the next. Authors from all over the country started booking spots months in advance, eager to experience the creative atmosphere of Harbor Haven. Through it all, Pumpkin remained a constant presence. The orange tabby had taken to lounging on the front desk, much to the delight of arriving guests. Children would squeal with joy when they saw him, and even the most stressed-out travelers would soften at the sight of his lazy stretches and contented purrs. One sunny afternoon, Wren sat in her new study, surrounded by stacks of her newly published novel. It had become a bestseller, surpassing even her agent's wildest expectations. She picked up a copy, running her fingers over the embossed cover before opening it to the dedication page. "To Elias and Pumpkin," it read, "who helped me find my own happily ever after." A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Elias leaning against the doorframe, a warm smile on his face. "Ready for a break?" he asked, holding up 2 steaming mugs of cocoa. Wren nodded, stretching as she stood up. "Definitely," she said, accepting the mug gratefully. They made their way to the inn's wraparound porch, settling into the comfortable chairs they'd placed there for this very purpose. The sun was beginning to set over Bellsleigh Harbor, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Elias reached over, taking Wren's free hand in his. "Happy?" he asked softly. Wren squeezed his hand, her heart full to bursting. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their cocoa and watching the sun's slow descent. Pumpkin appeared as if summoned, curling up at their feet with a contented purr. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Wren turned to Elias, her eyes bright with excitement. "I've been thinking about my next project," she said. Elias raised an eyebrow, an amused smile playing at his lips. "Oh? Do tell." "I'm thinking of starting a series," Wren explained, her words coming faster as her enthusiasm grew. "Set in a small coastal town, not unlike our own. Each book would focus on a different couple, but the town itself would be a character too, you know." Elias nodded, clearly enjoying her excitement. "Sounds perfect," he said. "Any ideas for the first book?" Wren grinned mischievously. "Well, I was thinking it might start with a stressed-out city girl who finds herself stranded in this charming little town." Elias laughed, pulling her close for a kiss. "Sounds familiar," he murmured against her lips. As they pulled apart, both laughing softly, the camera could have panned out, showing the twinkling lights of Bellsleigh Harbor coming to life in the gathering dusk. The scene was set not for an ending, but for a beginning. Of Wren's new series, of their life together, of countless stories yet to be told. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you. You can also leave reviews of the book and download it over on Amazon.